The border world of Kepler's Reach sat quietly at the edge of the Sol Dominion, a small human colony surrounded by empty stars. For 30 years, nothing much happened there. Farmers grew wheat under artificial suns. Miners dug metal from the asteroid belts. And far above the planet, old warships patrolled the black sky, engines humming with the tired sound of machines that had flown for far too long. These ships belonged to the Guardian Fleet, the public face of human military power. They were called Warhawk-class cruisers, built more than 40 years ago during the last great war humanity had fought. Their hulls were patched and repainted many times. Their weapons were old but reliable. Their crews were proud, but everyone knew the truth. These ships were relics of a different age. Admiral Elena Voss stood on the bridge of her flagship, the ISS Endeavour, watching the stars through the viewport. She was 52 years old, with gray streaks in her dark hair, and lines on her face that came from decades of service. She had commanded the Guardian Fleet for 11 years, and in that time, she had learned to live with a heavy secret. She knew the Guardian Fleet was old. She knew its ships could not win a real war against a serious enemy, and she knew that somewhere out there, in the dark spaces beyond the border, something was watching. That something was the Krythar hegemony. The Krythar were an old alien empire, older than humanity's history books could properly measure. They were insectoid in shape, tall and thin, with hard exoskeletons the color of dark amber, and 6 narrow eyes that could see in nearly every direction at once. They had conquered dozens of star systems over the centuries, absorbing weaker species into their hegemony through war, trade, or simple fear. They respected only strength, and they had little patience for species they judged to be weak. For years, Krythar scout ships had crept along the border of human space, gathering information. They watched the old Warhawk cruisers fly their patrols. They listened to human communications. They studied human shipyards, at least the ones they could find. And slowly, over many years, the Krythar High Command built a picture of the Sol Dominion in their minds. That picture was wrong. In a great council chamber, deep within the Krythar homeworld, General Threx stood before the Grand Assembly of Hegemony leaders. He was a decorated warrior, broad-shouldered even for a Krythar, with battle scars running down one side of his face, where the chitin had been cracked and healed in ridges. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had won many wars. "The humans are weak," he said, his voice clicking and hissing in the Krythar tongue, as translation devices converted his words for the human linguists, who would later study the recordings. "Their border fleet flies ships older than some of our soldiers. Our scouts report no new shipyards, no new weapons, no signs of growth. The Sol Dominion has grown fat and lazy during its long peace." One of the elder council members, a Krythar named Vesk, with pale, aged chitin, raised a claw to speak. "The humans defeated the Zerathi Collective 30 years ago. That was no small victory. We should not be careless." Threx made a dismissive gesture, a sharp flick of his upper limb. "The Zerathi were already weak when the humans fought them. Our scouts have watched the human border for 6 years. 6 years, Elder Vesk. In that time, we have seen nothing new. No new hulls. No new weapons signatures, only old ships, patched and repainted, flying the same patrols they flew a decade ago. If the humans had grown stronger, we would have seen it." What General Threx did not know, what none of the Krythar scouts had ever discovered, was that the Sol Dominion had indeed grown stronger. It had simply grown stronger in secret. 10 years earlier, after studying the near loss against the Zerathi Collective, the leaders of the Sol Dominion had made a difficult decision. The war against the Zerathi had been costly. Humanity had won, but only barely, and only through sacrifice and luck in equal measure. The Dominion's leaders realized that luck was not a strategy. They needed a stronger fleet, a fleet built with better technology, better weapons, and better ships than anything humanity had built before. But they also understood something important about their place in the galaxy. The Sol Dominion was still young compared to empires like the Krythar hegemony. It did not yet have the resources to fight and build openly at the same time. If word spread that humanity was building a powerful new fleet, other empires might see it as a threat and strike first, before the fleet was ready. So the Dominion's leaders made a choice. They would keep the old Guardian fleet flying its patrols along the border, exactly as it always had. Meanwhile, in secret, deep within the Dominion's core systems, far from any prying alien eyes, they would build something new. They called it Project Valkyrie. The project was hidden inside a massive shipyard, built within the rings of a gas giant called Thessaly, a planet so far from any border that no alien scout had ever bothered to survey it closely. The shipyard was built using new construction techniques that reduced its energy signature to almost nothing, making it nearly invisible to long-range sensors. Only a small number of people in the entire Dominion knew that Project Valkyrie existed. Admiral Voss was one of them. The chief engineer behind the project was a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen. She had been a young researcher when the Xerathi War ended, barely 30 years old, but she had a mind that saw solutions where others saw only problems. She had spent the last decade of her life inside the Thessaly shipyard, working alongside thousands of engineers and scientists to design and build a new generation of warships. The ships they built were called Aegis-class dreadnoughts, and they were unlike anything humanity had ever put into space. Their hulls were made from a layered composite material that could absorb and disperse energy weapon strikes far better than the old steel alloy hulls of the Guardian fleet. Their shields used a new kind of quantum field technology that could bend and redirect incoming fire instead of simply blocking it. Their main weapons, called singularity cannons, could tear through enemy shields and armor with frightening ease, and their targeting systems used advanced artificial intelligence that could track and predict enemy movements faster than any living pilot could react. By the time General Threx stood before the Grand Assembly declaring the humans weak, the Dominion had already built and crewed 30 of these new Aegis-class ships. They sat quietly in the shadow of Thessaly's rings, waiting. Admiral Voss had visited the shipyard only twice in the past 2 years, traveling under a false name aboard a civilian transport to avoid drawing attention. On her last visit, she had stood with Dr. Chen on an observation deck, looking out at the new fleet. "They're beautiful," Voss had said quietly. "They're ready," Chen had replied. "We just need the order." "Let's hope we never need to give it," Voss had said. But even as she spoke the words, she knew in her heart that hope was not the same as certainty. And deep down, she suspected that the order would come sooner rather than later. Back on the bridge of the Endeavor, Voss's thoughts were interrupted by the voice of her communications officer, a young lieutenant named David Park. "Admiral, we're picking up something strange on long-range sensors. Unidentified contacts, bearing 271, distance approximately 4 light hours." Voss walked over to the sensor display. The dots on the screen were faint, barely more than ghosts, but there were many of them. Dozens, maybe more. "Can you confirm contact type?" she asked. "Working on it, Admiral. Energy signatures suggest large vessels. Military configuration. The pattern doesn't match anything in our database, but..." Park hesitated. "Admiral, based on the size and grouping, I think this might be a Krythar fleet." The bridge went quiet. Every officer present understood what those words meant. For 6 years, the Sol Dominion's intelligence services had warned that the Krythar hegemony was growing more aggressive along the border, absorbing smaller alien nations one by one, always moving closer to human space. Everyone had hoped it would take longer before the Krythar turned their full attention toward humanity. It seemed that hope, too, had run out. "Get me a secure channel to Dominion Command," Voss ordered. "Priority 1. And someone wake up the Senate. They're not going to like what I have to tell them." While the channel was being prepared, Voss stood at the viewport again, looking out at the stars. Somewhere out there, dozens of Krythar warships were moving toward the border, confident that they were approaching a weak and outdated defense. They had no idea what was waiting for them in the shadow of a gas giant far behind the human lines. Voss allowed herself a small, grim smile. General Threx and his Grand Assembly had made a mistake that many overconfident conquerors had made before them throughout history. They had judged an enemy by what they could see, without considering what might be hidden. The Guardian fleet would have to hold the line for now. It would have to fight with old ships and old weapons, buying time with courage and sacrifice, the same way it always had. But this time was different. This time, somewhere behind them, help was waiting. The secure channel opened, and the tired face of Fleet Admiral Marcus Webb appeared on the screen, woken from sleep to receive the news. "Elena, this better be important," he said. "Marcus, they're coming," Voss said simply. "The Krythar fleet has crossed into our sensor range near Kepler's Reach. I estimate 50 or more warships, possibly more behind them. We need to decide, right now, whether it's time." Webb was silent for a long moment. Behind him, Voss could see him glancing at something off-screen, perhaps a calendar or a clock, calculating just how much time they had left to prepare, and how much time they did not have. "I'll wake the Senate leadership," Webb said finally. "But Elena, listen to me. The Guardian fleet needs to hold. Even if it's just for a few days. Valkyrie isn't ready to move yet. The activation protocols alone take time we might not have. How much time do we need?" 72 hours, at minimum, to fully crew and prepare the new fleet for combat deployment. Maybe less if we cut corners, but I don't want to send Chen's ships out half-ready. Voss closed her eyes for a moment, doing the math in her head. 50 Krythar warships against her 12 old Warhawk cruisers, stationed near Kepler's Reach. The math was not good. But she had faced bad math before, and the Guardian fleet had a long history of finding ways to survive against impossible odds. "I'll do what I can," she said. "But Marcus, if this is really the beginning of a full invasion, 72 hours might be more than we have. Then we'll find a way to buy more time," Webb said. "That's an order, Elena. Hold the line." The channel closed, and Voss turned back to her crew. 12 old ships, patched and worn but still flying, stood between the Krythar fleet and the millions of human lives living peacefully across the Dominion's border colonies. It was not a fair fight. It had never been meant to be a fair fight. The Guardian fleet's purpose, in the end, had always been to buy time, to be the first line of defense that absorbed the initial shock of any invasion long enough for something greater to arrive. Now, for the first time in decades, that greater force actually existed. "All hands, this is the Admiral," Voss said, her voice carrying through the ship's intercom system, reaching every corner of the Endeavor, and, through relay, every ship in her small fleet. "We have confirmed contact with what appears to be a large hostile force approaching our border. I know these ships are old. I know some of you have served on them for 20 years or more, but I need you to trust me when I tell you that this fleet, and everyone in it, matters more right now than you can possibly know. We are not just defending Kepler's Reach today. We are buying time for something the galaxy has never seen before. Hold the line. Help is coming." Across the 12 ships of her small fleet, thousands of crew members heard those words, and felt something they had not expected to feel, on what might be the last ordinary day of their lives. They felt hope. Far above Kepler's Reach, the Guardian fleet moved into defensive formation, old engines burning bright against the darkness, and far behind them, hidden in the rings of a gas giant most people in the galaxy had never heard of, 30 Aegis-class dreadnoughts sat waiting, their crews receiving urgent orders to prepare for launch. The Krythar fleet continued its advance, confident and unaware. General Threx, aboard his flagship, watched the sensor plots showing the small human fleet gathering near Kepler's Reach, and felt nothing but satisfaction. "So few ships," he said to his second-in-command, a Krythar officer named Draxus. "And so old. This will be even easier than we planned. Shall we begin the assault, General?" Threx's mandibles clicked together in what, for a Krythar, passed as a smile. "Begin the assault," he said. "Let the humans learn what it means to stand against the hegemony." Neither Threx nor anyone in the Krythar fleet had any idea that somewhere behind the old weathered ships of the Guardian fleet, a new kind of storm was gathering, one that would soon change everything they believed about the Sol Dominion, and everything they believed about the strength of humanity. The old warships held their formation as the first Krythar scout ships appeared on long-range sensors, dark shapes against the stars, the vanguard of an invasion that General Threx believed would be quick and easy. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The first Krythar scout ships appeared near Kepler's Reach 3 hours after Admiral Voss gave her order to hold the line. They came in fast, sleek vessels, built for speed and observation rather than heavy combat, and they immediately began scanning the human fleet, sending data back to the main Krythar force, still hours away. Voss watched the scout ships on her display and made a decision. "Captain Reyes, take the Halcyon and the Bastion. Intercept those scouts. Don't let them get a full picture of our formation." Captain Marcus Reyes, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s who had served under Voss for nearly a decade, gave a sharp nod from his own ship's bridge, visible on the split-screen display. "Understood, Admiral. We'll chase them off." The 2 Warhawk cruisers broke formation and moved to intercept. It was a small engagement, more a chase than a real battle, but it was the first shots fired, in what would become one of the most important wars in human history. The old cruisers fired their forward railguns, and though the Krythar scouts were fast, they were also lightly armored. One scout ship took a direct hit and broke apart in a silent flash of light. The others turned and fled back toward the main fleet, carrying with them images and sensor data of old human warships, exactly the kind of information General Threx expected to see. "You see, Draxus," Threx said, reviewing the data aboard his flagship. "Old ships, predictable tactics. This confirms everything our intelligence has told us." What Threx did not know was that Voss had ordered her ships to intercept the scouts for a second reason, beyond simply protecting information. She wanted the Krythar to see exactly what they expected to see. If the enemy believed the Guardian fleet was all humanity had, they would commit their forces carelessly, without caution, without holding anything back to guard against a surprise. Every old, worn-out cruiser that fought and fell in the coming battle would help convince the Krythar that there was nothing more to fear. It was a painful kind of strategy, one that Voss hated even as she ordered it. She would be sending brave men and women to fight and possibly die, in ships that everyone knew were outdated, partly for the purpose of maintaining a deception. But she believed, with everything in her heart, that it was necessary. The lives lost now, in careful and controlled engagements, would save far more lives later if the deception worked, and the Krythar walked confidently into a trap they could not see. 6 hours after the first scout engagement, the main Krythar invasion fleet arrived at the edge of the Kepler's Reach system. It was an intimidating sight. More than 60 warships, ranging from mid-sized cruisers to massive Krythar battleships, nearly twice the size of anything in the Guardian fleet, formed up in a wide attack formation designed to surround and crush any defense. Admiral Voss stood on the bridge of the Endeavour and watched the enemy fleet grow larger on her tactical display with each passing minute. 12 ships against 60. The math had not improved. "Admiral," said Lieutenant Park from the communications station, "Dominion Command is asking for a status update. They want to know if we should evacuate Kepler's Reach." Voss thought of the colony below, the farmers and miners and their families, more than 2 million people who called that world home. Evacuation of a full colony took time measured in days, not hours. There was no way to move that many people before the Krythar fleet arrived in weapons range. "Tell Command we're doing everything we can to protect the colony," Voss said. "And tell them we need Valkyrie ready as soon as possible. Every hour we can buy matters." Far behind the battle lines, in the shadow of the gas giant Thessaly, Dr. Sarah Chen worked without rest alongside her engineering teams, running final diagnostics on the 30 Aegis-class dreadnoughts. The activation of Project Valkyrie was not as simple as flipping a switch. Crews needed to be briefed. Systems needed to be calibrated. Weapons needed to be tested to ensure they would function properly in real combat, not just in simulations. Chen had spent 10 years of her life on this project, and now, with the moment of truth finally arriving, she felt a mixture of pride and fear that she had never experienced before. Pride, because she and her team had built something extraordinary, ships that represented the very best of human engineering and ingenuity. Fear, because in a matter of hours, those ships and the people crewing them would be tested in the deadliest way possible, against an enemy fleet that had conquered dozens of worlds. "Dr. Chen," said her assistant, a young engineer named Tomas Reyes, no relation to the Captain Reyes fighting at Kepler's Reach. "The last of the crews have finished their emergency training simulations. Every ship reports ready status, except the Valiant, which is still finishing shield calibration." "How long until the Valiant is ready?" 2 hours, maybe less." Chen nodded, glancing at the countdown timer on her display, showing the estimated time until the Krythar fleet would reach the outer edge of the Kepler's Reach system, based on the last sensor data from Voss's fleet. The numbers were close, too close for comfort. Back at Kepler's Reach, the battle had begun. The Krythar fleet opened the engagement with a massive barrage of long-range plasma torpedoes, dozens of glowing projectiles streaking through the darkness toward the human formation. Admiral Voss had prepared for exactly this kind of attack, ordering her ships into a loose defensive formation that spread out the incoming fire and gave each ship room to maneuver. "Point defense systems, fire at will," Voss commanded. The Warhawk cruisers, old as they were, still carried functional point defense cannons, designed to shoot down incoming projectiles before they could strike. Bright flashes lit up the darkness, as most of the torpedoes were destroyed before impact. But not all of them. The Bastion, one of the two ships that had chased off the Krythar scouts earlier, took 3 direct hits along her port side. The old cruiser shuddered violently, alarms blaring across her bridge, as sections of hull armor were torn away by the explosive force. Captain Reyes, commanding from the neighboring Halcyon, watched in horror as his sister ship's shields flickered and failed. "Bastion, report status," Reyes called over the comm channel. There was a burst of static, then the voice of the Bastion's captain, strained but steady. "Hull breach on decks 4 and 5. We've lost forward shields, but engines and weapons are still functional. We can keep fighting." "Fall back to the second defensive line," Voss ordered over the fleet-wide channel. "All ships, controlled withdrawal. We are not trying to win this fight outright. We are trying to survive it and slow them down." The Guardian fleet began a careful, disciplined retreat, firing as they withdrew, using the superior maneuverability that came from decades of crew experience to avoid the worst of the incoming fire. It was not glorious fighting. It was desperate, grinding, painful combat, the kind where every decision meant the difference between a ship surviving another hour or being lost forever. General Threx watched the battle unfold from his flagship with growing satisfaction. "They retreat already," he said to Draxus. "Just as our intelligence predicted, the humans do not have the strength to hold their ground. Should we pursue and destroy them completely, General?" Threx considered this for a moment. Part of him wanted to crush the retreating human fleet entirely, to demonstrate absolute Krythar dominance from the very first engagement. But he was also a careful commander, and he remembered old lessons about the dangers of overextending a fleet in unfamiliar territory. "No," he decided. "Let them retreat toward their colony. We will take Kepler's Reach first, secure it as a forward base, and then continue our advance at a controlled pace. There is no need to rush. The Sol Dominion has nothing that can stop us." For the next several hours, the battle continued in this pattern. The Guardian fleet fought defensively, trading space for time, losing ground but inflicting whatever damage it could on the much larger Krythar force. 2 more Warhawk cruisers were badly damaged, forced to retreat toward emergency repair facilities deeper within Dominion space. No human ships were completely destroyed, a small mercy that Voss attributed to the skill and experience of her crews, but the fleet as a whole was clearly losing the fight. By the end of the first day of battle, the Krythar fleet had taken control of the outer edge of the Kepler's Reach system, and the human colony itself lay directly in their path. Evacuation ships, hastily organized by Dominion Command, worked around the clock to move as many civilians as possible off the planet's surface, but with only hours before the Krythar fleet would be in position to bombard the colony, there was simply not enough time to save everyone. Deep within the halls of the Dominion Senate on Earth, a fierce debate raged. News of the invasion had spread quickly, and while most information about the battle remained classified for security reasons, enough had leaked out to cause panic among the general population. Senators argued late into the night about how to respond. "We should be requesting terms of surrender," said Senator Aldrich Voss, no relation to the Admiral, a cautious politician who had never supported military spending. "We cannot win this war. Better to negotiate now, while we still have something to negotiate with, than to lose everything in a hopeless fight." "Surrender is not an option," replied Senator Miriam Osei, one of the few Senate members who had known about Project Valkyrie from its beginning. "We have prepared for exactly this scenario. We have a fleet ready to fight back. What we need now is the courage to use it." The argument continued for hours, senators divided between fear and hope, between the instinct to protect what remained through negotiation and the belief that humanity still had a chance to defend itself through strength. Finally, Fleet Admiral Marcus Webb was called before the Senate to give his professional assessment. "Senators," Webb said, standing before the assembled leadership of the Sol Dominion, "I understand the fear in this room. I share some of it myself, but I need you to understand something important. We did not build the Aegis fleet as a last resort weapon, to be used only in the most desperate circumstances. We built it as a shield, meant to be used exactly when it is needed most. That time has come. If we hesitate now, out of fear or caution, we risk losing everything we worked so hard to protect. I am asking this Senate to authorize the full deployment of Project Valkyrie, immediately." The Senate chamber fell silent as the weight of the decision settled over everyone present. Finally, the Senate president called for a vote. The result was close, closer than Webb would have liked, but in the end, the vote passed. Project Valkyrie was authorized for full combat deployment. Word reached Dr. Chen within minutes. She was standing in the main control room of the Thessaly shipyard when the authorization came through, and for a moment, she simply stood still, feeling the enormous weight of the decade of work behind her finally reaching its purpose. "Dr. Chen," said Tomas Reyes, "orders confirmed. Full fleet deployment authorized. The Valiant just finished her final calibration 10 minutes ago. All 30 ships report ready status." Chen took a deep breath. "Then it's time," she said. "Contact Admiral Webb. Tell him the Valkyrie fleet is ready to launch." Far away, at Kepler's reach, Admiral Voss stood on the battered bridge of the Endeavour, watching the Krythar fleet begin its bombardment preparations above the human colony. Her ships were damaged, her crews exhausted, but they had done exactly what was asked of them. They had bought time. Now she could only hope that the time had been enough. "Admiral," Lieutenant Park called out, his voice carrying a note of desperate hope. "Priority message from Fleet Command. Authorization confirmed. Valkyrie fleet has launched. Estimated arrival at Kepler's reach. 4 hours." Voss closed her eyes for a brief moment, relief washing over her exhausted body. 4 hours. Her fleet could hold for 4 more hours, even in its damaged state, especially now that she knew help was truly on the way. "All ships," she said, her voice steady despite everything her fleet had endured. "Hold formation. Continue defensive operations. Reinforcements are inbound. We just need to hold a little longer." Above Kepler's reach, General Threx prepared to give the order for planetary bombardment, still utterly confident in his coming victory, completely unaware that 30 ships, unlike anything he had ever encountered, were now racing toward his position, carrying weapons and technology that would soon shatter every assumption the Krythar hegemony had ever made about the strength of the Sol Dominion. The old fleet had done its job. Now it was time for the new fleet to arrive. The Aegis-class dreadnought Valiant led the Valkyrie fleet out from behind the rings of Thessaly, 30 ships moving in perfect formation, their new engines burning with a clean blue light, very different from the aged, smoky drives of the Guardian fleet. Inside the Valiant's bridge, Admiral Voss stood at the command station, having transferred her flag from the battered Endeavour just an hour earlier, brought aboard by a fast courier ship the moment the new fleet launched. She looked around the bridge in something close to wonder. The Endeavour's bridge had been cramped, filled with analog switches and worn control panels that had been repaired so many times that some of them barely matched their original design anymore. The Valiant's bridge was different entirely. Sleek holographic displays floated in the air, showing tactical information in crisp, clear detail. The ship's artificial intelligence, a system the crew had nicknamed Athena, calmly reported updates in a smooth, calm voice that somehow managed to feel reassuring, even in the middle of a crisis. "Admiral Voss," Athena said, "we are 4 hours from Kepler's reach at current speed. Would you like me to calculate an intercept course that would reduce travel time?" "Do it," Voss said. "Get us there as fast as possible, without damaging the fleet." Dr. Sarah Chen stood nearby, having insisted on joining the fleet's flagship for its first combat deployment, wanting to see with her own eyes how the ships she had spent a decade building would perform in real battle. She had never been in actual combat before, and despite her confidence in the technology, she felt a nervous flutter in her stomach that no amount of engineering knowledge could fully calm. "How are you feeling, Doctor?" Voss asked, noticing the tension in Chen's posture. "Nervous," Chen admitted. "We've tested everything in simulations 1,000 times, but simulations aren't the same as real combat. I keep wondering if we missed something, some flaw we didn't catch." "You built something remarkable," Voss said. "Trust your work. We're about to find out together." The Valkyrie fleet adjusted course, and Athena's calculations shaved nearly an hour off their travel time, cutting through space, using precise navigation that took advantage of gravitational currents around nearby star systems. As they traveled, Voss received continuous updates from her remaining forces at Kepler's reach. The situation had grown desperate. The Guardian fleet, reduced to just 9 functional ships after the first day of fighting, was struggling to protect the evacuation efforts as the Krythar fleet closed in on the colony. Captain Reyes, still commanding the Halcyon, sent a message that arrived on the Valiant's bridge with a note of exhaustion clear in his voice. "Admiral, they're moving into bombardment position. We've evacuated about 60% of the colony, but we're running out of time, and running out of ships to protect the transports." "How much longer until Valkyrie arrives?" Voss checked the display. 3 hours, Captain. Hold on. We're coming." "Understood, Admiral. We'll hold as long as we can." Above Kepler's reach, General Threx prepared his fleet for the final assault on the colony. He had grown slightly frustrated by the persistence of the human defense, more stubborn than he had expected from what his intelligence reports described as a weak and outdated force, but he remained confident that victory was close at hand. "Begin bombardment sequence," he ordered. "Target the colony's primary population centers first. We will demonstrate the futility of resistance." Krythar battleships began moving into position, their massive orbital cannons charging with enough energy to devastate entire cities in a single strike. Below on the planet's surface, evacuation efforts became increasingly frantic as word spread that the bombardment was about to begin. Families rushed to loading platforms, carrying only what they could grab in the final moments, while the last remaining human warships desperately tried to shield the transport ships carrying them to safety. Captain Reyes positioned the Halcyon directly between a group of Krythar cruisers and a convoy of evacuation transports, absorbing enemy fire that would have otherwise destroyed the fleeing civilians. The old cruiser shook violently as plasma weapons tore into her already damaged hull. "Shields at 20%, reported his tactical officer. "We can't take much more of this, Captain." "Hold position," Reyes ordered through gritted teeth, watching the transport ships behind him slowly gain distance and enter faster than light travel, one by one escaping toward the safety of deeper Dominion territory. "Just a little longer. Every ship we protect is another few thousand lives saved." It was in this desperate moment, with the Guardian fleet stretched to its absolute limit, and the Krythar bombardment fleet moving into final position, that the Valkyrie fleet arrived. They did not arrive with dramatic engine flares or obvious warning. The Aegis-class ships used advanced stealth technology that kept their approach hidden from Krythar sensors until the very last possible moment. General Threx's sensor operators detected nothing unusual until 30 massive warships suddenly appeared on their scanners, already within weapons range of the Krythar bombardment fleet. "General," shouted a Krythar sensor officer, his voice cracking with alarm. "New contacts, directly ahead, weapons range." "I don't understand how they got so close without detection." Threx turned to look at the tactical display, his 6 eyes widening as he took in the sight. 30 warships, unlike anything Krythar intelligence had ever recorded, formed a tight defensive line between his fleet and the human colony below. Their design was sleek and advanced, radiating energy signatures far more powerful than anything the old Guardian fleet cruisers had shown. "Where did these ships come from?" Threx demanded. "Our intelligence reports showed nothing like this." Before anyone could answer him, the Aegis-class dreadnoughts opened fire. The Singularity cannons fired in perfect coordinated bursts, streams of concentrated energy that tore through Krythar shields as though they were made of paper. A Krythar cruiser near the front of the bombardment formation took a direct hit and simply ceased to exist, torn apart in a silent explosion of light and debris. Another cruiser, struck by 2 simultaneous shots, suffered the same fate seconds later. On the Valiant's bridge, Dr. Chen watched the battle unfold on the main display, her nervousness replaced by a strange mixture of awe and grief. Awe at seeing her creations perform exactly as designed, tearing through enemy ships with devastating efficiency. Grief, because even as she celebrated the success of her work, she understood that real people, even if they were Krythar, were dying in front of her. "Admiral," Athena reported calmly. 3 enemy cruisers destroyed. Enemy formation is beginning to break apart. Recommend continued advance to press the advantage." "Do it," Voss ordered. "Full advance. Target their battleships next. We need to stop that bombardment before it starts." The Valkyrie fleet surged forward, their shields absorbing and dispersing the frantic, disorganized fire that the Krythar ships managed to return. The new quantum shielding technology performed exactly as Chen and her team had designed it, bending incoming energy weapons around the hull instead of simply absorbing the impact, dramatically reducing the damage each ship took even under heavy fire. General Threx watched his carefully organized bombardment fleet descend into chaos within minutes. Ships that should have been overwhelming a weak human defense were instead being destroyed one after another by an enemy force that, according to every piece of intelligence he had ever received, should not have existed. "General, orders?" Draxus asked urgently, his voice carrying a note of panic that Threx had rarely heard from his second-in-command. Threx hesitated, his mind racing to process information that contradicted everything he believed about the Sol Dominion's military capabilities. For a brief, dangerous moment, doubt crept into his thoughts, but decades of pride and confidence quickly overrode that doubt. "This changes nothing," Threx declared, though his voice carried less certainty than it had just hours earlier. "We still outnumber them significantly. Concentrate all fire on their lead ship, break their formation, and the rest will fall." The Krythar fleet turned its focus toward the Valiant, dozens of ships firing everything they had at the human flagship, in a desperate attempt to remove what they believed was the head of the human command structure. Energy weapons and plasma torpedoes converged on the Valiant from multiple directions. Inside the ship, alarms sounded as the shields absorbed the massive combined assault. "Shield integrity at 85%, Athena reported, her voice remaining perfectly calm despite the intensity of the attack. "No critical damage detected." Dr. Chen let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. 85%, after taking fire from what looked like nearly 20 enemy ships simultaneously. The old Warhawk cruisers would have been destroyed several times over by an attack of that magnitude. "Return fire," Voss ordered. "Target their concentration point. Let's show them what happens when they focus everything on one ship and forget to protect the rest of their formation." The Valiant and its escorting Aegis-class ships redirected their fire toward the cluster of Krythar ships that had grouped together to attack the flagship. Without the benefit of proper spacing and mutual support, the tightly grouped Krythar vessels made an easy target. Singularity cannon fire tore through the formation, destroying 6 ships in a matter of moments and severely damaging several more. Watching this from his own flagship, General Threx finally understood the true scale of the mistake his empire had made. The intelligence reports his scouts had gathered over 6 long years of careful observation had been completely wrong, or perhaps, he realized with a chill running through his exoskeleton, they had been deliberately deceived. "Send an emergency transmission to Hegemony High Command," Threx ordered, his voice now carrying none of the confidence it had held just hours earlier. "Inform them that the Sol Dominion possesses advanced warships previously unknown to our intelligence networks. Request immediate reinforcement." But as the message was being prepared, the battle continued to turn decisively against the Krythar fleet. Ship after ship fell to the coordinated assault of the Aegis-class dreadnoughts, their advanced targeting systems and powerful weapons proving far superior to anything the Krythar hegemony had encountered in generations of warfare. Captain Reyes, watching from the battered bridge of the Halcyon, felt a surge of emotion he could barely contain as he witnessed the new fleet turning the tide of a battle that just hours earlier had seemed hopeless. "I don't believe it," he murmured to his crew. "They actually did it. They actually built something that can win this." Within another hour, the remaining Krythar bombardment fleet, reduced from its original numbers by nearly half, began a chaotic retreat, ships breaking formation and fleeing in different directions in a desperate attempt to escape the devastating new human weapons. General Threx, forced to accept the reality of his situation, ordered a full withdrawal of his forces from the Kepler's Reach system. As the last Krythar ships fled into faster-than-light travel, Admiral Voss stood on the Valiant's bridge, watching the battle's aftermath with a complex mixture of relief and exhaustion. The colony below had been saved. The evacuation transports had escaped safely, and for the first time in the war, humanity had shown the galaxy a glimpse of the true strength it had been hiding. "Admiral," Athena reported, "all enemy contacts have withdrawn from the system. Colony population confirmed safe. Guardian fleet casualties, moderate. Valkyrie fleet casualties, minimal." Dr. Chen finally allowed herself to smile, tears of relief and pride mixing on her face, as she watched the tactical display confirm what she had spent a decade working toward. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Voss placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Doctor. This fleet, everyone aboard it, they're alive today, because of your work. But this is just the beginning. The Krythar know about us now. They'll come back, and they'll come back with everything they have." Far away, aboard his retreating flagship, General Threx stared at the tactical readouts, showing the devastating losses his fleet had suffered. and felt something he had not felt in many decades of successful conquest. He felt fear, and beneath that fear, a grudging, painful respect for an enemy that had proven far more dangerous than anyone in the hegemony had ever imagined. The message he had sent to High Command would soon reach every corner of Krythar space, and beyond it, to the many other alien nations that watched the growing conflict with cautious interest. The old assumption that the Sol Dominion was weak, an assumption built on years of careful but ultimately mistaken observation, had been shattered in a single afternoon of battle above a small border colony called Kepler's Reach. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity had been hiding something extraordinary, and the coming days would prove that this first battle was only the opening move in a war that would reshape the balance of power across known space. News of the battle at Kepler's Reach spread quickly across Krythar space, and from there, out into the wider galaxy. The Hegemony High Command received General Threx's emergency transmission with a mixture of disbelief and alarm. For generations, the Krythar had built their empire on the foundation of overwhelming military superiority, and the idea that a young species like humanity could field warships capable of defeating a well-prepared Krythar fleet was almost impossible for many of the elder council members to accept. "This must be exaggeration," said one council member during an emergency session of the Grand Assembly. "General Threx has never lost a major engagement. Perhaps he seeks to excuse a tactical failure." But the sensor recordings and damage reports that accompanied the transmission left little room for doubt. Independent analysts within the hegemony military reviewed the data and confirmed what Threx had reported. The Sol Dominion possessed a previously unknown fleet of advanced warships, and that fleet had destroyed or damaged more than half of a 60-ship invasion force in a matter of hours. Elder Vesk, the same council member who had urged caution weeks earlier, stood before the Grand Assembly with a grim expression. "I warned this council that the humans should not be underestimated. Now we have paid the price for our arrogance. The question before us is not how this happened, but what we intend to do about it." The Grand Assembly debated for days. Some council members argued for an immediate, overwhelming counterattack, believing that the hegemony's vast resources could simply overpower the Sol Dominion through sheer numbers, regardless of how advanced the new human fleet might be. Others urged caution, suggesting that the hegemony gather more intelligence before committing further forces to a war that had already proven more costly than expected. In the end, the aggressive faction won out. General Threx, despite his defeat, was given command of a much larger invasion force, more than 150 warships drawn from across Krythar space, along with several allied species who owed military service to the hegemony under old treaties. The Grand Assembly wanted a decisive victory, one that would erase the humiliation of Kepler's Reach and restore the hegemony's reputation for invincibility. Word of this massive fleet buildup reached the Sol Dominion through its intelligence networks within weeks. Admiral Webb called an emergency meeting of the Dominion's military leadership, including Admiral Voss and Dr. Chen, to discuss how to prepare for the coming assault. "Our intelligence suggests the Krythar are gathering a fleet of at least 150 ships," Webb said, standing before a large holographic display showing projected enemy formations. "They're not just sending Threx back with reinforcements, they're bringing allied forces from at least 3 other species under hegemony control. This will be a much larger fight than Kepler's Reach." "How many Aegis-class ships do we have ready?" Voss asked. 45, as of this morning," Chen answered. "We've been building as fast as we can since the battle, but 45 is still far short of what we'll need to face a fleet that size directly." "We won't need to face them directly if we choose our battlefield carefully," Voss said, studying the star map displayed before them. "The Krythar will likely advance through the Aurora Gate system. It's the most direct route into Dominion core territory, and it has a natural choke point created by an asteroid field that limits fleet maneuverability. If we position our forces there, we can use the terrain to our advantage." Webb nodded thoughtfully. A defensive position with terrain advantages could offset some of the numbers gap. "But Elena, even with terrain on our side, 150 ships against our combined forces is still a serious risk." "We won't be facing them alone," Voss said. "We'll combine the Aegis fleet with what remains of the Guardian fleet and every other ship the Dominion can spare. It won't be an easy fight, but it's winnable if we plan carefully." Over the following weeks, the Sol Dominion worked around the clock to prepare for what everyone understood would be the decisive battle of the war. The Aurora Gate system, a quiet region of space containing a small research outpost and little else of strategic value under normal circumstances, was transformed into a fortress. Mines were seeded throughout the asteroid field, defensive platforms were constructed at key positions, and the combined might of the Aegis fleet and the surviving Guardian fleet ships gathered to await the coming Krythar assault. Captain Reyes, promoted to command a small squadron of ships following his performance at Kepler's Reach, found himself standing on the bridge of a newly commissioned Aegis-class ship called the Perseverance, a strange but welcome change from the aging Halcyon, which had been sent back for extensive repairs after the damage it sustained during the first battle. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" said his new executive officer, a young lieutenant named Amara Singh, commanding a ship like this after so many years on the old cruisers. "Strange is one word for it," Reyes replied, running his hand along the smooth, advanced control console. "I spent 15 years learning every quirk and weakness of the Halcyon. This ship feels like it barely has any weaknesses at all. Let's hope that holds true when the Krythar arrive." 3 weeks after the Grand Assembly's decision, General Threx's massive invasion fleet crossed into Sol Dominion territory, moving directly toward the Aurora Gate system exactly as Admiral Voss had predicted. Threx approached this second campaign with far more caution than his first, having learned a painful lesson at Kepler's Reach. His scouts probed carefully ahead of the main fleet, watching for any sign of the advanced human ships that had devastated his previous force. "Scouts report the Aurora Gate system is heavily defended," Draxus reported to Threx, as the fleet approached the asteroid field, marking the entrance to the system. "Sensor readings confirm a significant human presence, including multiple ships matching the profile of the vessels that attacked us at Kepler's Reach." "How many?" Threx asked. "Estimates suggest between 40 and 50 of the advanced warships, along with a smaller number of the older cruisers." Threx considered this information carefully. His fleet still outnumbered the human defense by a considerable margin, more than double their reported strength, but the memory of Kepler's Reach weighed heavily on his mind. Those advanced ships had proven far more dangerous than raw numbers alone could explain. "We will not repeat the mistake of a direct assault," Threx decided. "Divide the fleet into 3 groups. The main force will advance through the primary approach, while 2 smaller groups attempt to flank the human position through alternate routes around the asteroid field. If we can force them to divide their attention, we can overwhelm their defense from multiple directions." It was a sound tactical decision, one that showed Threx had genuinely learned from his earlier defeat. But Admiral Voss had anticipated exactly this kind of strategy, having studied Krythar military doctrine extensively in the weeks leading up to the battle. "They'll try to flank us," she told her assembled captains during a final briefing before the battle began. "Krythar tactical doctrine favors divide and conquer strategies when facing a numerically inferior but qualitatively superior enemy. We need to be ready to respond to attacks from multiple directions." The Dominion fleet was divided accordingly, with the main force under Voss's direct command positioned at the primary choke point, while 2 smaller detachments, each built around a core of Aegis-class ships supported by Guardian fleet cruisers, waited at the likely flanking routes Voss had identified through careful analysis of the asteroid field's natural pathways. The battle began with the Krythar main force advancing directly into the asteroid field choke point, engaging Voss's primary defensive line in a fierce exchange of fire. The narrow confines of the asteroid field limited how many ships could engage at once, playing directly into the Dominion strategy of using terrain to minimize the numbers disadvantage. "Enemy main force engaging," Athena reported from the Valiant's bridge. "Estimated 40 enemy vessels in direct contact. Additional forces detected attempting flanking maneuvers through secondary routes, as predicted." "Send word to Reyes and Singh," Voss ordered. "The flanking attacks are coming exactly where we expected. Tell them to hold their positions and spring the trap when ready." At the northern flanking route, Captain Reyes watched his sensors as a group of nearly 30 Krythar and allied ships attempted to slip through a narrow pathway between asteroid clusters, believing they had found an undefended route around the main Dominion line. What they did not know was that Reyes and his squadron of 12 Aegis-class ships, along with mining charges secretly placed throughout the pathway in the weeks before the battle, were waiting for exactly this moment. "Detonate the charges," Reyes ordered, as the enemy formation moved into the center of the trap. A series of powerful explosions tore through the asteroid field, sending massive chunks of rock crashing into the tightly packed enemy formation. Several ships were destroyed outright by the debris, while others suffered severe damage that left them vulnerable and disorganized. Before the surviving Krythar ships could recover from the chaos, Reyes gave the order to attack. All ships, engage. Show them what happens when they try to flank a trap that was set specifically for them. The Aegis-class ships tore through the disorganized enemy formation with devastating efficiency, their advanced weapons and superior tactics overwhelming the shocked and scattered Krythar vessels. Within 20 minutes, the northern flanking force had been almost completely destroyed, with only a handful of surviving ships managing to retreat back the way they had come. A similar scene played out at the southern flanking route, where Lieutenant Singh, having proven herself capable during the preparation phase of the battle, commanded a second squadron that sprung an identical trap on the southern Krythar flanking force. Between both ambushes, nearly 60 enemy ships were destroyed, or forced to retreat, before they ever reached the main battle. General Threx, still engaged in the fierce fighting at the primary choke point, received reports of both flanking forces' destruction, with growing horror. His carefully planned strategy, the one he had believed would avoid the mistakes of Kepler's reach, had instead walked directly into an even more devastating trap. "General, our main force is taking heavy losses," Draxus reported urgently. "Without support from the flanking groups, we cannot maintain this engagement much longer." Threx looked at the tactical display, watching as ship after ship of his once mighty invasion fleet was destroyed or crippled by the combined might of the human defense. The Aegis-class dreadnoughts fought with a precision and coordination that seemed almost impossible, their advanced targeting systems allowing them to focus fire with devastating efficiency on the most threatening enemy vessels first. "This cannot be happening again," Threx muttered, watching his fleet crumble before him for the second time, in a war he had once believed would be an easy conquest. At that moment, Reyes and Singh's squadrons, having destroyed the flanking forces, moved to reinforce the main battle line, striking the already weakened Krythar main force from an unexpected angle. Caught between Voss's main defensive line and the newly arrived reinforcements, General Threx's fleet found itself surrounded and overwhelmed. "General, we are losing," Draxus said, his voice carrying a note of desperation that even Threx's pride could not ignore. "If we continue this engagement, we will lose the entire fleet." Threx stared at the display for a long, painful moment, watching the destruction of a force he had commanded with such confidence just weeks earlier. Finally, he made the decision that no Krythar general in living memory had been forced to make against a species the hegemony had once dismissed as weak. "Order a full retreat," he said quietly. "Signal all surviving ships to withdraw from the system immediately." As the remaining Krythar ships fled the Aurora Gate system, leaving behind the wreckage of more than 100 destroyed or captured vessels, Admiral Voss watched the battle's conclusion with a heavy but determined heart. The Dominion had won a decisive victory, one that would send shockwaves through the Krythar hegemony and the wider galaxy beyond. But she knew, even in this moment of triumph, that the war was far from over. "Admiral," Athena reported, "Krythar forces in full retreat. Battle casualties confirmed. Dominion losses, moderate but sustainable. Enemy losses, catastrophic." Dr. Chen, watching from the Valiant's bridge alongside Voss, felt the same complicated mixture of pride and sorrow she had experienced during the first battle, now magnified by the sheer scale of destruction she had witnessed. "We won," she said quietly, almost disbelieving the words even as she spoke them. "We won this battle," Voss corrected gently, "but General Threx and the Krythar hegemony have suffered a humiliation they will not easily forgive. This victory may force them to the negotiating table, or it may push them toward even greater aggression in a desperate attempt to restore their pride. We need to be ready for either outcome." Far away, aboard his retreating flagship, General Threx prepared to send another transmission to Hegemony High Command, this one far more difficult to compose than his first. As he stared out at the stars, contemplating the devastating losses his fleet had suffered and the uncertain future that awaited both his career and his empire's ambitions, he found himself wondering, for the first time in his long military career, whether the Krythar hegemony had finally met an enemy it could not simply overpower through strength and numbers alone. The galaxy was watching closely now, and the outcome of this war between the young Sol Dominion and the ancient Krethar hegemony would soon determine the balance of power across known space for generations to come. The defeat at Aurora Gate sent shockwaves through the Krethar hegemony that reached far beyond the Grand Assembly's council chamber. News of the battle spread across every world under hegemony control, and soon after, out into the wider galaxy, through neutral trade networks and independent news services. For the first time in centuries, the Krethar hegemony had suffered not just a defeat, but a humiliation, losing more than 100 warships to a species many had considered young and unremarkable just months earlier. The political consequences were immediate and severe. Several smaller species that had been forced into the hegemony through conquest or coercion began to see an opportunity in the Krethar's weakened state. Whispers of rebellion spread through star systems that had long been quiet under hegemony rule. Even some of the hegemony's willing allies, species who had joined the Krethar for protection and mutual benefit rather than through conquest, began quietly reaching out to the Sol Dominion through neutral diplomatic channels, seeking to understand exactly how powerful this new human fleet truly was. Within the Grand Assembly itself, the defeat triggered a bitter political struggle. General Threx, once celebrated as one of the hegemony's finest military commanders, found himself facing intense criticism from council members who had supported the aggressive invasion strategy and now needed someone to blame for its failure. General Threx has failed this council twice, declared a council member named Corax during a tense emergency session. First at Kepler's Reach, and now at Aurora Gate, losing an even larger fleet than before. His command should be stripped immediately. Elder Vesk, who had opposed the aggressive invasion from the very beginning, rose to speak, though his words carried none of the satisfaction one might expect from someone whose warnings had proven correct. This council bears equal responsibility for these defeats. We approved an invasion built on flawed intelligence and outdated assumptions about human capability. Punishing General Threx alone will not fix the deeper problem. We must ask ourselves whether continuing this war serves the hegemony's true interests, or whether pride alone is driving us toward further disaster. The debate that followed was the most contentious in the Grand Assembly's recent history. Some council members, particularly those who had always favored aggressive expansion, argued for an even larger third invasion, believing that the hegemony's vast resources could eventually overwhelm the Sol Dominion through sheer persistence, regardless of how many ships were lost in the process. Others, increasingly aware of the political instability spreading through hegemony territory as a result of the two defeats, argued that continuing the war risked far greater losses than simply the ships and soldiers involved. While this debate raged within Krethar space, the Sol Dominion used the time to prepare for whatever came next. Admiral Voss and Fleet Admiral Webb worked closely with Dr. Chen's engineering teams to continue expanding the Aegis fleet, while also developing new defensive strategies based on lessons learned from the two major battles already fought. Dr. Chen, in particular, focused her efforts on a new project during this period, one aimed not at building more warships, but at improving the long-range sensor and communication networks along the Dominion's border. If we can detect enemy movements earlier and communicate faster across our territory, she explained to Voss during one planning session, we can respond to threats before they become full-scale invasions. Prevention is always better than fighting a war we could have avoided. 3 months after the battle at Aurora Gate, the Krethar Grand Assembly finally reached a decision, though it was not the one many had expected. Rather than launching a third invasion, the council voted to send a diplomatic delegation to the Sol Dominion, officially requesting a meeting to discuss the possibility of a negotiated peace. The vote had been close, and many suspected that the growing unrest among the hegemony's subject species, rather than any genuine desire for peace, had ultimately forced the council's hand. The news reached Admiral Voss while she was aboard the Valiant, conducting a routine inspection of the expanded Aegis fleet, now numbering nearly 80 ships following months of accelerated construction. Fleet Admiral Webb's transmission carried a note of cautious optimism that Voss had not heard from him in a very long time. "They want to talk peace, Elena," Webb said. "The Senate has authorized a diplomatic mission. They're asking if you would be willing to accompany the delegation, given your direct experience commanding forces against the Krethar." Voss considered the request carefully. She had spent the better part of a year fighting against the Krethar hegemony, watching good people on both sides die, in a war that had begun because of a simple, devastating miscalculation about human strength. The idea of finally bringing that conflict to an end, through negotiation, rather than continued bloodshed, appealed to something deep within her that had grown tired of war. "I'll go," she said. "But Marcus, we need to negotiate from a position of strength, not weakness. The Krythar respect power. If we show any sign of desperation for peace, they may see it as an opportunity to demand terms that favor them despite their defeats." "Understood. The Senate agrees. We'll bring a small honor escort of Aegis-class ships to the negotiation, enough to demonstrate our continued strength without appearing overly aggressive." The peace negotiations took place aboard a neutral space station, located in territory controlled by neither empire, a carefully chosen location meant to ensure both sides felt secure enough to negotiate honestly. Admiral Voss led the human delegation, accompanied by several Senate representatives, and, at her specific request, Dr. Sarah Chen, whose engineering achievements had ultimately made this entire war, and its resolution, possible. The Krythar delegation was led not by General Threx, whose reputation had been too badly damaged by the war's failures to serve as a suitable diplomatic representative, but by Elder Vesk himself, the council member whose early warnings about underestimating humanity had proven prophetic. When the two delegations met for the first time, there was a palpable tension in the room, the weight of a war that had cost thousands of lives on both sides hanging over every word spoken. But as the negotiations progressed over several days, that tension gradually gave way to something more productive. "I will admit," Vesk said during one particularly candid session, speaking through a translation device that rendered his clicking, hissing Krythar speech into clear human language, "that this council badly misjudged your species. We saw old ships and assumed weakness, when in truth, we were simply failing to see what you had chosen to hide from us. It is a mistake I hope both our peoples can learn from." Voss nodded thoughtfully. "We hid our strength because we wanted peace, not war. The Sol Dominion has no interest in conquering the Krythar hegemony, or any other empire. We built the Valkyrie fleet because we learned, through hard experience in an earlier war, that peace without the ability to defend it is simply an invitation for someone else to take it away. We would much rather have never needed to use those ships at all." The negotiations eventually produced a peace treaty that satisfied neither side completely, as most honest negotiations tend to do, but which both delegations agreed represented a fair and lasting resolution to the conflict. The Krythar hegemony agreed to recognize the full sovereignty of Sol Dominion territory and to cease all military operations along the shared border. In exchange, the Sol Dominion agreed to establish trade relations with the hegemony and to assist in mediating disputes between the hegemony and its increasingly restless subject species, using the credibility earned through military victory to help stabilize a region of space that had grown dangerously unstable during the war. When Admiral Voss returned to Earth following the successful conclusion of the peace negotiations, she found herself celebrated as a hero throughout the Sol Dominion, though she personally felt uncomfortable with much of the attention. At a ceremony held in the Dominion's capital city, surrounded by Senate leaders, military officers, and thousands of citizens who had gathered to witness the historic moment, Voss stood alongside Dr. Chen, as both women received the Dominion's highest honors for their roles in defending humanity against the Krythar invasion. "You know," Chen said quietly to Voss as they stood together during the ceremony, watching the celebration unfold around them, "when I started working on Project Valkyrie, 10 years ago, I never imagined it would end like this. I thought, if we ever had to use those ships, it would mean we had already failed to keep the peace. In a strange way, I think building that fleet is exactly what allowed us to keep the peace," Voss replied. "Not by avoiding war entirely, because sometimes war finds you, no matter how much you wish to avoid it, but by giving us the strength to end that war quickly, and to negotiate afterward from a position where both sides could find a fair resolution rather than simply imposing terms through continued destruction." In the months and years that followed, the story of the battles at Kepler's Reach and Aurora Gate spread throughout known space, becoming something of a legend among the many species who had watched the conflict unfold from a cautious distance. The tale of an old, weathered fleet that had quietly held the line, while a hidden force of advanced warships prepared to strike, became a cautionary story told throughout the galaxy, a reminder that judging any civilization's strength based only on what could be easily observed was a dangerous and often costly mistake. The Sol Dominion, once viewed by many older galactic powers as a young and relatively unremarkable species still finding its place among the stars, found its diplomatic standing transformed almost overnight. Other empires, having witnessed the devastating effectiveness of the Aegis-class fleet and the careful, patient strategy that had brought it into existence, began treating humanity with a new level of respect and caution. Trade agreements multiplied. Diplomatic missions from distant species arrived at Earth, seeking to establish relations with a civilization that had proven itself capable of both remarkable technological achievement and, perhaps more importantly, the wisdom to use that achievement with restraint rather than aggression. General Threx, stripped of his military command following the war's conclusion, spent his remaining years studying the battles that had ended his career, eventually writing extensively about the dangers of underestimating an enemy based on incomplete information. His writings became required study within Krythar military academies, a permanent reminder of the costly lesson the hegemony had learned at the hands of a species they had once dismissed as weak and unprepared. Admiral Voss continued to serve the Sol Dominion for many more years, eventually rising to command the entire Dominion fleet before her retirement. She often reflected, during quiet moments away from public attention, on the old Guardian fleet ships that had fought and sacrificed so much during those early days of the war, buying time with courage and old technology, while a new fleet prepared in secret to change everything. She made sure that history remembered those old crews, insisting that memorials be built honoring every ship and every sailor who had served aboard the aging Warhawk cruisers during humanity's darkest hours. Dr. Sarah Chen went on to lead the Sol Dominion's continued technological development for decades afterward, though she often said that nothing she built later in her career ever felt quite as significant as those 30 Aegis-class dreadnoughts that had emerged from the shadows of a gas giant to save a small border colony, and in doing so, changed humanity's place among the stars forever. And throughout the galaxy, among species who had never even heard of Earth before the war, a simple lesson spread and endured, carried in stories told across countless worlds. Never assume you understand the true strength of another people, simply because of what they choose to show you. Sometimes, the greatest strength lies hidden, patient and quiet, waiting for the moment when it is needed most. The old warships had held the line. The new fleet had arrived, and humanity, once again, had proven that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage of all.